On this episode of SSI Executive Conversations, Darwin meets with Trudy Estridge, Director of Regulatory Affairs of Spectral MD, to discuss her background and expertise in biomaterials, how clinic backgrounds has been beneficial, and why RA leaderships consider more opportunities for clinicians, and how her background has allowed growth in the area of AI.
I am extremely excited to welcome Trudy Estridge onto the SSI Executive Conversations podcast. I have really enjoyed getting to know Trudy as a regulatory affairs professional and as a person. She's currently the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at Spectral MD. Trudy is a medical device, really an executive with a broad bandwidth of experience in regulatory, clinical, and is a biomaterials subject matter expert, has achieved commercial regulatory clearances and approvals in the United States, Europe, and Canada, has managed international submissions to secure regulatory approvals in Australia, New Zealand, Asia Pac, the Middle East, as well as throughout South America. Additionally, she's got a complex background and experience in directing clinical research in the United States as well as Europe to support product approvals. So I'm really excited to have this conversation about the career in regulatory affairs and her background to share it with our following. So thanks so much, Trudy, for being willing to share your time with us.
You're welcome, Darwin.
So let's jump right in. I think that one of the areas that we've talked about is in terms of your scientific background and your expertise in biomaterials and how different materials kind of go together. So could you kind of share with us how that background's helped you in your regulatory career?
Yeah, so when I went off to school, I had maybe a one direction that wasn't exactly what I'm doing now. But I
Hmm.
went off to school because I wanted to develop devices that attached or were in some ways interfacing with the body. Um, I had gotten really keen on that from watching the TV show $6 Million Man.
Yeah.
I really, like that, and so, I looked around, and tried to find a program, and I found a program at Texas A&M in biomedical engineering, so I started off there, and not really knowing what specialty I wanted to be as far as in biomedical engineering. um and actually, all of my degrees are in biomedical engineering,
Yeah.
and and it's I think the main thing that career initially taught me was the environment that I was supposed to be designing things for. Um,
Okay.
instead of like, I wasn't looking at roads. I wasn't going to make a civil engineer, right? I
All
was going to
right.
be designing things for the body, and so um, that is the confines of what you work with in medical devices is it's either in or on the body or connected to the body in some way. So it gave me a foundation in that, and I think in engineering is a nice foundation for electrical, mechanical types, and you also have all the biology that comes into play. um, I think the other thing that you get in biomedical engineering that's helpful is kind of the first semblance of knowledge of product development,
Yeah.
um, where other other engineerings aren't going to be so directed. So early on, we talked about the FDA, we talked about working in projects, and so I think all of that played into putting my foundational parts in place. I think going so I have a PhD also, and so not all people that work in regulatory have um, higher level degrees. I think
Right.
the main thing that it gave me was the ability to work with very complicated types of systems and systems that might include other components like drugs,
Hmm.
or you know, organic materials like collagen into them or portions of proteins into them, so that it gave me more a foundation for that.
I think that was one of the first things that I appreciated when you and I first started to get to know each other and understanding the complexity of your background. But drug-eluting stents and catheters, and it's kind of funny you were talking about the $6 million man, because I remember sitting on the couch with my parents as a kid watching that. And there's another superhero show. I'm not even going to mention it. I don't think I've ever told anybody, but that was the first time. My mom was a nurse, but just that first started making me want to be in the clinical area. I remember that. So, which kind of is a nice segue into my next question. But I believe having a clinical background can really bring great value to from several different angles, and I think it's helped me in this sort of second career in my life in terms of this business, and regulatory affairs is no exception. Can you kind of share your perspective on how your clinical background has benefited you, and why regulatory leadership at companies might consider more opportunities for clinicians from a crossover perspective in the industry?
Yeah, so when I think back about my clinical experience, people might think it was just in the professional sense, right? Like
Hmm.
running clinical studies. But actually, my clinical experience started at a much, much younger age. And I think all of the clinical experience was helpful. So, my grandmother was a surgical LVN.
Wow.
And so, at a very young age, she would talk about surgery. And I wasn't, I really liked it. I listened to her and, and really started to learn what she did and so forth. And because small town with a very small hospital, my grandmother was able on off hours to take me into the surgical suites.
Oh,
And
nice.
and so again, it kind of nudged you in that kind of direction. Later, in high school, I worked as an LVN. No, I'm sorry. I worked with LVNs as a nurse's aide. But because I was working the night shift and I was in this really small rural hospital, I was getting to help them do all types of things that, a normal nurse's aide wouldn't get to do.
Right.
So again, it was kind of bringing in more of that. And then when I went to college, um, we had different courses that interfaced us with the clinical side. So, we at certain times would have um, times where we would be going on what we call rounds with the doctors. So when they would see patients and we would get to see what they were doing. And um, I at that time, I was at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and that school, has a nursing school, a medical school, uh, an optometry school, and a dental school. So and I had teachers in different portions of them, and so at various times, we would be interfacing and seeing some portion of patients being seen, maybe just watching a surgery, and so you were again getting a sense for the environment that the surgeons worked in and so forth. And then, obviously later as you started working, I was initially in preclinical research. And so I did a lot of work with doctors teaching how to do certain procedures. And then as we developed product, we would actually, I would be involved in training the surgeon and at
Oh,
their,
wow.
so, and then
Did
later
you
on,
did Trudy? To ask you, when you first got to do that shadowing and got to do that support in the facility, did that patient care piece and maybe some of the aspects, the humanity aspects of that, did that come very natural to you, or were you a little squeamish at first? How was that for you?
I don't think I was ever squeamish because I had learned from my grandmother.
Okay.
What went on, and she would talk about these things, it never made me ill or squeamish or something. I do remember distinctly my father telling me when we were going to grandmother's for a meal that I was not to bring up anything about surgery.
So the reason I asked you that, my mom, was a nurse. She ran a nursing home for a while. She did pretty much every clinical application of nursing, including psychological. And so I was in different clinical settings around, with her. But when I first got into respiratory school, I mean, I was good to go. But the first time I had to do an arterial blood gas or, NT suctioning, I thought, I'm not going to make it. I'm like, I don't think I could do this. Now, it didn't take me very long to kind of adjust to that. And then when we went through clinical trials, the ER ambulance and the surgeries, I found it fascinating, but I was just kind of curious about that. So then you were saying you were actually getting to train the physicians on certain aspects of what you were doing.
Yeah, so we had some sort of complicated products that required you to kind of do some assembly parts, and so we would have to train the surgeon, and um, I was involved at that. So I would go out with the clinical team at the time, and demonstrate the product, and then train them on the product, and and then later on, I was involved in overseeing clinical teams.
Okay.
Um, so it's not, I guess what I'm trying to say is that each one of those pieces helped me learn the clinical environment, right?
Yeah.
And um, so it doesn't always just happen at school. I guess that's what I'm trying. Doesn't just happen at school. Doesn't just happen on the job. But I think it's really, really valuable that everyone involved in the development of medical device gets some exposure to clinical so that
Yes.
they can understand the 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 issues that the nurses, if it's being used in surgery, what they're facing. If it's not being in surgery and it's being in the ER, do you understand what that environment's like? So that you can do a better job about designing. So I fully support the doctors interfacing with us and us interfacing with them in their environment so we can understand what they're up against.
I think that's really smart, and I think I agree with you. I think that's correct. And there's a company that we're looking to partner with that's based out of Europe, and I had a recent dialogue with the CEO, and we that conversation was around mission statement of the company, the value to patient populations, and really, hiring people that fit the culture and that I'm big on personal why matching the company's culture because in terms of fit, how you can grow with the company, and if you're not passionate about what you're doing. And he had come in, and in a short period of time, really had to make some adjustments to their culture. They had a town hall meeting, and they'd never had anybody that benefited from their product speak, to the company. And so he had a patient come in and do a presentation, and it was really cool. But that, in the same way that you're talking about that understanding of how it benefits people, I think it enriches the perspective of the value that you're bringing, which is good for the ecosystem. Um, Okay, so I kind of talked a little bit earlier about your diverse background in drug-eluting stents, drug-eluting catheters. You've worked with some really unique, complex medical device products, PMA uh, products, but the digital health and software as a medical device niche is a really growing area. I know you and I have talked about the investment in digital health, how wearable technologies are growing, but for you, and with what Spectral MD does, they've got. I'm really excited about their product in terms of artificial intelligence and analytics and how imaging can improve patient outcomes for wound care patients. But that's kind of a newer pathway for your career. So when you think about kind of what you've done and then moving into this area, with Spectral MD recently obtaining breakthrough designation status, maybe share your thoughts on how this new aspect, this new journey, and this growing area where artificial intelligence is going to be extremely impactful, how that plays into your career path.
Yeah, so when I look at jobs, I always am looking for a job that is going to help expand me a little bit. It's going to build on what you already have,
Yes.
but expand you a little bit. Um, and with Spectral MD, their basic, area that they're focusing on is in burns and wound healing. And turns out that, in order to do biomaterials, you have to learn a lot about wound healing
Yes.
in order to understand it. So, it's building on that. You also, I personally have an affinity for, technical gadgets and software and those kinds of things. So it kind of builds on that. But it does, stretch you because the new AI type of devices are expanding the capability of what a device might be able to do for us. And so I see it as a great, growth period for not just my company, but other companies out there that are interested in this area and are working to adapt technology to help us out in this area. So I definitely see that the market um, would appear, from my novel area, would appear that there will be more devices that we will use that will incorporate software. Not only just software, but software as a medical device.
Hmm.
Most of us are wearing probably, one medical device like a watch. I mean, a potential medical device, which is like a watch that maybe is helping monitor our blood glucose. That's something
Yeah.
that's out there. We have other pieces of software that are coming through that are monitoring our heart. And so it's not just something that the doctor gets, but the patient gets direct information about. Um, even if you think about activity software that tracking how many steps you take, you can just think about, well, how could that be used in the future? So I think it's an
Yeah.
exciting area.
I do too. And when you think about, I think diabetes is a great example in general of how multiple companies have had good products, and as we've moved from pumps and people having the ability to measure their blood glucose and look at what they need to do with insulin in a more efficient way versus blood sticks. But that entire area is really moving towards kind of I kind of call it a Star Wars race between these different companies about really creating an experience where the patient and the caregiver can manage their experience more so than just what that product category is. And so I think that really ties in when you look at AI interoperability. You certainly just mentioned some different products, but for Spectral MD, there is 30% of wounds are misproperly diagnosed, which obviously isn't good for the patient. And then in terms of wasted resources and labor costs and our hospital systems, for me, I know we talked about your initial experience with tissue. Mine was in the burn unit, managing a ventilator. So really indirect. I wasn't directly responsible for the wounds, but when you saw patients that didn't have wounds properly, and obviously it's a very challenging area. And then in McKesson, later on in my career, getting to deal with different types of decubitus wounds and wounds that don't heal. It's the second largest expense in skilled nursing after falls. And so to have something that can take analytics and artificial intelligence and imaging and give that bedside clinician in real time direction on how to treat that wound, I think it's pretty exciting where that technology could go.
For the video recording of this podcast, along with additional resources, make sure to find us on the web at shurigsolutions.com and follow us on social media and LinkedIn at Shurig Solutions.